What's going on?
The legend is back.
Is this your new studio?
It's a makeshift studio. It's my new house, which I'm excited to have you over. And we're setting up a studio here for real.
Well, I mean, I would love to talk politics, but I don't think that's a good intro for our Brian Armstrong episode.
What were you going to say?
No. I mean, there's just a lot that's happened in the last few months.
Totally. We'll have to do another one at some point. But well, first off, before I let Natasha in from Coinbase, are you comfortable asking? Feel free to say no to this, but are you comfortable asking the first question just on a nod to your time working together, or would you?
Bro, I already responded on text. Like, did you check your text?
Okay, my bad. Oh, Brian here.
Brian Armstrong.
Oh wow!
Hello.
Brings back memories. Good to see y'all.
Hey, Brian.
Brian, thank you for joining Moment of Zen.
Thanks for having me. Good to spend a little more time. I get to see y'all on the interwebs a lot here and in the private group chats, and feel like we've sort of known each other for forever, but I haven't actually gotten to spend that much time talking to y'all. So this is great.
Well, we've spent a little time.
That's true. Dan, you're the exception. You and I have been in the trenches together, and I love your battlefield promotion story where someone was like, "How did you get to be VP of Ops at Coinbase?" And you were like, "There was nobody left." Everybody.
Well, we've spent a little.
Everybody else had quit or gotten fired. It was not as glamorous as it sounds. That was a good moment.
Startups.
Well, that is the segue. Kick us off.
Yeah, but what are you spending your time on these days? I think we were kind of discussing prior to the show, and I always think that like just where you spend your time is actually an interesting sign of what you're focused on for Coinbase.
Yeah, sure. And are we recording or not? I can't tell. We are. Okay.
And we just launch right into it.
Well, where I've been spending most of my time is number one on product at Coinbase, and I want to keep making sure I spend my time on that. It's dangerous a little bit if companies get too engrossed in litigation and policy, and you can lose track of the most important thing. It's like Microsoft with the DOJ, right? In the lost decade, you got to make sure you're still focused on product. So that's my number one priority. That's what 95% of the company is focused on. But we do have a really amazing team of policy folks and lawyers. So we're also focused on getting good policy outcomes for crypto. So been spending more time in D.C. We'll have to get clarity either through the courts or Congress or new administration, et cetera. And then, I have a few side projects too. I want to see techno-optimism come to fruition. I want to accelerate the future. I want to create a better civilization. So been allocating some money and time into things like biotech, trying to accelerate scientific research. So those are some fun passion projects on the side, and ties neatly actually into the mission of Coinbase around increasing economic freedom. I think those things are all linked together.
And on the product side, where have you been spending a lot of time on the base stuff, on the like kind of centralized portion of the business, or kind of across the whole portfolio?
Well, Coinbase is definitely moving more and more on chain and doing more work on the decentralized side. So I got to give a huge shout out to the team there and Jesse and all the folks. I think, I wish I could take more credit for that. I think if anything, the only thing I did was really just shield it a little bit from the big company bureaucracy and make sure that it had the funding and the space to actually get going. And so, yeah, I mean, we've been doing Coinbase Wallet for a long time, which is self-custodial. That's a form of decentralization. Things like Coinbase Commerce, we're doing more and more like on-chain payments, trying to drive real-world utility. I think launching our own layer 2 solution with Base just accelerated that. And now we're starting to get a lot of innovative pieces coming together, like smart wallets, just making onboarding to wallets a lot easier. We're playing around with things like tap to pay between wallets for like peer-to-peer transactions. And Base has just gotten so big so fast. I think it's the number one layer 2 out there in terms of transactions processed and contracts deployed and metrics like that. So we're basically just trying to put together a really awesome developer toolkit so that lots of things can be built on there. I know there's like a lot of Farcaster frames and a lot of decentralized social and like a whole payment stablecoin thing is now finally working because we can kind of do transactions under 1 second, 1 cent anywhere in the world. So one of the places all these developer tools are coming together that I've been spending time on is actually Coinbase Developer Platform. CDP is what we call it, kind of like AWS. So it's cdp.coinbase.com. It's a place where we're putting all of our developer tools into one spot. And we've got a bunch of stuff there like On-Chain Kit, helping people build these apps sort of natively in the Web3 ecosystem. And then we also have like an MPC API. We're trying to expose a lot of the tools that we have internally at Coinbase to build products to third parties so that hopefully every fintech and bank and startup and Web2 company can integrate into the crypto economy.
Brian, I'm curious. So when I was at Coinbase and I left in 2019, you were very focused on how to kind of create repeatable innovation within the company. And I know we had experimented with GMs and business units, and you had been talking to a lot of kind of bigger tech company founders on how they kind of ran their business and the different models. How has that evolved over time, and kind of how are you guys structured today to kind of allow something like Base, which is risky, fragile new idea that obviously has done really well in the last year? Like how you evolved your thinking on that?
Yeah, so I think it's really important. This is actually one of the things I think Coinbase has done well, and it took a lot of iterations to get here. But the thesis behind it was that if you're having some new technology wave that's happening, it's a little bit hard to know exactly what the big contributors to value and revenue and everything are going to be, right? Like if you were sitting there in the early days of the internet, people thought, oh, well, the web browser is going to be like the big thing. And it turned out web browsers were free and search was a big thing, right? Or social was a big thing. And sometimes you get these companies that it gets hard enough to find product market fit once as a startup. And a lot of companies find it once and they really never do anything again. And so I really wanted Coinbase to be a company that had repeatable innovation and could have a portfolio of bets. And it requires a bit of humility you don't really know which ones are going to take off. And so you got to try a lot of small bets, shield them from the bureaucracy, give them room to run, but also be willing to kill them if they're not working. And so I'll give you a couple of frameworks that we have in place for this, and I'll tell you some of the ones that worked and some of the ones that didn't too. So one of our frameworks is 70-20-10 resource allocation, right? Which we borrowed from Google. And 70% of our resources are on the core business that's generating most of the revenue. It's important to not, you want to keep the main thing, right? Like sometimes companies can lose the most profitable market that they're in. And so there's always this tension of like, why are we giving resources to this tiny startup when most of the revenue is over here? And so you need to have some framework. So for us, it's 70% on the core, 20% is on these adjacent bets that are, you could call them extensions of the core. Like an example would be if we're doing well in spot trading in the US, why don't we launch derivative trading in the US, right? That would be an adjacent bet. Or if we're doing well with our trading business, why don't we expand into more countries with it or something like that? So it's reasonable extensions of the core. The 10% is kind of the most important for this discussion, which is the venture bets. And these are intended to be, they can higher risk, really ambitious things, which they can have a higher rate of failure, but if they work, they should really work big. And the goal is you have to keep the teams really small, right? So, ideally it's like 3 to 5 people or 2 to 5 people. It's kind of like a YC startup or something. One of the mistakes we've made is we've put like 60 people on a venture bet and it actually went slower and wasted a bunch of money and didn't work, right? That was like probably Coinbase NFT was an example of that. It didn't work, right? So the goal is you got to try a bunch of these small bets. And then, another learning from this was like on the venture bets, you don't want to have this driven by consensus or committee. I think some venture capital firms, they actually require like a unanimous yes from all the partners. That always seemed a little weird to me. I was a little bit more in the Peter Thiel camp, which was like, disruptive innovation is usually contrarian, but right, which sort of by definition, a committee of people are not all going to agree it's a good idea. Some people are going to think it's completely crazy. Maybe 1 or 2 people thinks it's a really good idea. So we host this thing for our venture bets twice a year internally at Coinbase where any employee can come and pitch. And you basically can pitch the leaders of any of the product groups, which have their own budgets. You can pitch me. I'm on the panel. There's also 2 or 3 people that are kind of like, just like more junior crypto forward engineers and kind of really people that we think are on the frontier. And so they get added on this panel, but you're sort of coming in and pitching us as one of the employees. And if you get any one of us to say yes and fund it out of our budget, then you're good. It's kind of like pitching a bunch of venture capitalists. You don't have to get them to all say, it's just got to get one term sheet. And so an example of this that worked really well was like USD coin, right? That was a tiny team of like 2 or 3 people that helped get that off the ground. And I use it as an example actually, because I voted no on USD coin and it still got funded internally. And it sounds dumb in hindsight, but my rationale was like, I don't know, it seems a little centralized. I thought like the decentralized stablecoins would. the algorithmic stablecoins would do better. But, lo and behold, it turned out to be this like massive success and big revenue driver for us. So it shows you how much I know. But I think the key here is basically
that was a team of 3, right? It was like Jacob Horn and a couple of early engineers.
Yeah, it was a very small team, and they had help from finance and legal to kind of get it out. But it was, yeah. So it was a 2-pizza team, like very small. That's probably why it was successful in some ways. So anyway, long story short, I want to try a bunch of those, have a portfolio of bets. Some of them don't work out, and the ones that do, you need to recognize like not all good ideas are going to come top down. Steve Wozniak famously went and pitched his boss at HP like, hey, I think we should build a personal computer. He had to get 6 yeses all the way up to the CEO to sort of get it approved at HP. Famously, he left and started Apple, right? And so there's kind of like that fear that I have sometimes internally at Coinbase, which is we become HP and miss out on some next big thing.
Brian, one quick question. It's almost like this mantra in crypto that like it's early, right? Which I think it is actually in crypto. And I think it's Chris Dixon and A16Z who show the adoption of crypto versus the adoption of the standard internet. And people forget that, for example, there was roughly 20 years between the first email being sent and then Hotmail, which was kind of the first mass adoption. And ditto, by the way, 20 years between the transistor and the integrated circuit and the PC and the internet and mobile. I mean, there's literally 10 or 20 years that have to go by crypto to have crypto kind of happen. But obviously, as someone who works in the crypto space, particularly when it comes to things like user acquisition and marketing, kind of wondering like what's going to be like the breakout hit that just makes it flip inside like the proverbial my grandma, at home type thing. We're seeing a little bit of that, I think, with Polymarket, right? Which is kind of an interesting consumer application. Just yesterday, I have no stake in any of these companies, just to be clear, but I just think it's super cool. Perplexity is doing a media deal with Polymarket such that, like, at least in my circle, Polymarket screenshots are being shared like, Nate Silver's graphs used to be shared 10 years ago, right? I'm curious if you have any personal bets in terms of, and there's a lot that does have PMF, to be clear. I'm not saying it doesn't, but in terms of like the mass market adoption, is it going to be like a Web3 game? Is it going to be yet another financial application? I don't know. I wouldn't have predicted prediction markets as being perhaps one of the dimensions along which it grew. But I'm curious if you have personal bets on like where Web3 consumer, is it going to be something like Telegram coming on chain, for example? They're building out their own ecosystem.
Yeah, Telegram's definitely gotten a lot of traction. It'd be interesting to see if some of the other messaging apps also add self-custodial crypto wallets, which would be cool. But yeah, I mean, I think, so in terms of adoption, we're seeing a lot of this on Base, for instance, where there's just a lot of people doing payments with stablecoins, right? It sounds like kind of maybe boring as a use case, but I mean, everybody in the world has to do payments pretty much every day, right? Food, transportation, housing, all the basics. There's a whole e-commerce segment that's pretty underserved by the current technologies. There's a lot of people in emerging markets who really want access to the dollar. They're trying to run their business, not have it as a refuge from inflation. Even the dollar has some inflation, so eventually they'll probably want Bitcoin and stuff. So I'm pretty bullish on payments now that we have layer 2 stablecoins, identity and smart wallets, and it feels like the Lego pieces are finally coming together. Another one is actually social. Like, I'm pretty bullish on social. I think Farcaster, Dan's here, has done an incredible job getting real world utility going. And there's other ones that are really good too. I mean, we're seeing, Rodeo and Zora and MoshiCam and all these kind of new media companies. It's sort of like you could imagine a version of Spotify, YouTube, X, Instagram, TikTok. Everything is gonna get built on chain, and that's something I think just regular people will do, because especially once they have a way to actually directly monetize their content, it'd be nice if every heart you got on X or every like or upvote you got on Reddit, you were actually getting microtransactions and people could remix it and make derivative work of it. And there was this beautiful kind of attribution chain for all the influences or origins, and that, I think that'll probably work. And then, we're actually seeing a lot of like in person, like IRL stuff, small business stuff, like with Blackbird is a good example. Just like restaurants and all these things have high pain points around the current financial system because they're low margin businesses. So it's really tough to be paying like 2 to 3% in credit card fees if your margin is only 10%, right? It's like if you could get that down to 0.1% or something, that's like materially improves the margin of your business. So anyway, I think we'll see it in lots of different areas like that. And then just like the internet, there'll probably be some totally weird stuff like Polymarket that comes out of left field. And I think basically we're going to see something's going to get hot like every few months. And as these tools mature, that's just going to be a really exciting time and place to be.
Yeah, not to pump Dan's ego too much, but when they launched Forecaster Frames, I was at Facebook in 2010 when they launched Open Graph, which is funny because Frames actually uses Open Graph tags as like the markup for the framification. But this notion of like having a mini app inside a social experience in which you can actually transact was like something you couldn't have even have imagined into that. Like would have been impossible to implement. Right? Even now, it would be hard to implement identity and transactions natively inside a thing. So that's one of the few places where I had vibes like, wow, this is like better than Facebook when it hit its hockey stick growth.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors.
This episode is brought to you by WorkOS. If you're building a B2B SaaS app, at some point your customers will start asking for enterprise features like SAML authentication, skim provisioning, role-based access control, and audit trails. That's where WorkOS comes in, with easy-to-use and flexible APIs that help you ship enterprise features on day one without slowing down your core product development. Today, some of the hottest startups in the world are already powered by WorkOS, including ones you probably know, like Perplexity, Vercel, Jasper, and Webflow. WorkOS also provides a generous free tier of up to 1 million monthly active users for user management, making it the perfect authentication and authorization solution for growing companies. It comes standard with rich features like bot protection, MFA, roles and permissions, and more. If you are currently looking to build SSO for your first enterprise customer, you should consider using WorkOS. Integrate in minutes and start shipping enterprise plans today.
The less your business spends, the more margin you keep. But today, everything costs more. So smart businesses are graduating to NetSuite by Oracle. NetSuite is the #1 cloud financial system, bringing accounting, financial management, inventory, HR into one proven platform, helping you reduce IT costs, maintenance costs, and manual errors. Over 37,000 companies have already made the move to NetSuite.
Backed by popular demand, NetSuite has extended its one-of-a-kind flexible financing program for a few more weeks.
Head to netsuite.com/102. That's netsuite.com/102.
Let me ask a follow-up, Brian, which I often think about a lot. So I got crypto pilled a little late. I don't know if you remember, by the way, but we had a phone call like in 2014 when I left Facebook. I think it was before we even met Fred. And I, like an idiot, didn't follow up on the conversation, joined Coinbase at the time. I'm sure you don't remember, but it was like 10 years ago. So I got crypto pilled a little later. But then I'm like, wow, this is amazing. I think I'm a little bit older than everyone in this room. I'm like part of the bridge generation that remembers like the analog universe of going to a library and going through a card catalog. And then now I'm as like digital native, or I think I am as anybody. But what's interesting, why I got crypto pilled is I looked at crypto and I realized, you know, a lot of the internet is still very skeuomorphic, right? Like PDF documents are basically paper documents, even forms on websites. A lot of things that we do and say are actually still kind of skeuomorphic of that analog world. I looked at crypto and the blockchain and I thought, you know, if you were to redesign the internet for a purely virtualized digital lifestyle in which you don't have legacy institutions telling you what's true or correct or right or wrong or what's legal, and that you're kind of, I mean, to me, crypto is the radical notion of extracting ownership and value from the hands of the state or sort of physical institutions. And that's kind of what the future of crypto is. My one fear, of course, is that maybe it arrived 30 years too early, right? And it's going to take us like 20 years to go through this cycle before everyone kind of catches up to the way people live now. But I'm just curious if you agree with that, if in some sense you think crypto is a new way of interacting with sort of the information, because I think it is. And you've often said publicly, like, you know, you're for expanding economic freedom. I'm wondering, does crypto have other implications beyond just payments, which of course it obviously has PMF when it comes to payments. But I'm just curious, what is the wider impact? And just to name something and kind of pull the pin on the grenade and throw into the podcast, you know, Balaji's network state, for example, which I think you're speaking at the network state conference in after 2049, if I'm not mistaken. I'm curious, just to pull back for a second, do you see like greater implications for like the nation state going to the network state, or just human life in general, when you have things like on-chain consensus, you have decentralized ownership, you have all these interesting primitives that crypto has created?
Yeah, okay, so great broad question. So I think in terms of how we interact with information on the internet, I agree. I think crypto is reshaping that. And we have this big problem in society today, which is, how do you know what's true, right? There's kind of this information warfare, you know, both sides of the aisle politically are doing it, but all kinds of folks are doing it around the world. And so, you know, it's not just like AI deepfakes, which everyone seems to be worried about. I'm actually not that worried about that. I think we already live in a world where we can't tell what's real, so AI is not going to change it that much. I think it's basically people are just making tons of claims, and like, how do you fact check it? And sort of one view people have is that there are quote unquote experts that you need to rely on, which I'm deeply skeptical of. And I think the other answer is it's kind of like the wisdom of the crowds, right? And basically building reputation around oracles or like sources of truth. And so I am kind of interested and excited about how crypto could come together and provide veracity or just information signal on what is true and what's not. There was a great idea. I've heard other people talk. This is not my own original idea, but it'd be great if we just had like a reputation system for every article, every journalist, every media company writ large, and you could kind of make leaderboards of like Hall of Fame, Hall of Shame kind of thing of, most accurate, least accurate. And it would take time to figure out, you basically could use oracles and stuff on chain to like have people have real skin in the game to try to derive sources of truth. And I think that would be an interesting thing to create more accountability in the media, because I know you all are kind of think about this a lot too, but it is unfortunate that basically it seems like all traditional media companies have gone super left, or most of them are super left, but there's some on super right too. But there's very few, if any, I can think of that are actually sort of neutral, just trying to report the facts. And I do think we need to build new media companies to replace all those. To your broader question about like the network state and just unbundling the state, I do think crypto has implications far beyond just payments and money. So, we saw this a little bit with identity, right? Like ENS has started to unbundle that part of the state of like, because traditionally identity comes from a government issuing you pieces of paper, driver's license or whatever. If you have an identity that starts to become more meaningful online, that's another unbundling. And then I think with DAOs, you start to see things like with voting and governance. So I'm definitely very interested in, special economic zones, I would say, in various places around the world, ways that you can sort of tokenize real estate and actual physical land to create better forms of society and governance. I think, the founding fathers, and I've studied like just a little bit, I'm not an expert. I think they were obviously like geniuses. It was this huge breakthrough, and like the American experiment has a long way to go, but I do think America is in slow decline right now. Europe is in decline. Like there's all these issues. Freedom of speech is under attack. So I do think with humility, we all should be thinking about how do we extend that experiment that founding fathers started in America and sort of preserve freedom, because I do think it's under attack, and there's a lot of tech debt in the United States about more and more laws accumulating, more and more things are illegal, and we're actually losing freedoms, not just economic freedom, freedom of speech, other forms of freedom. So I would like us to all in crypto think about how we actually go create physical places in the world to preserve freedom over the long term. I think that's ultimately crypto's destiny, and economic freedom is just like a foundational pillar of that.
Whenever you found the crypto state, sign me up. I know we've probably both had conversations with Balaji about it. He's very excited about it, and I'm interested to see what comes out of that.
Yeah.
So you mentioned technical debt, which is a great term for a lot of what's going on in the U.S. I think Erik also introduced you mentioning some of the work, and we're all rooting for you. Coinbase is doing in D.C. around crypto regulation, which I think is amazing. I myself randomly spent a year at a D.C. think tank called the Foundation for American Innovation, and it was fascinating. I got dragged in, as I'm sure you did way more time doing this than I did. You go on the Hill and the staffers bring you in to the office of senator or congressman or woman, whatever. And they say, can you explain Web3 or crypto to me? And so you go into this whole spiel. I'm curious, not necessarily going into details or mentioning names, but I found it a tremendously enlightening experience. And it wasn't necessarily that depressing, to be honest. I met lots of smart people of goodwill on DC who were trying to get it right. Like it wasn't actually as cynical an experience as I thought it would be. Mm-hmm. I'm curious at a very high level. Yeah, what was that experience like? What did you learn from that? What did you come away with, encountering, the Leviathan that is DC, if you can talk about that.
Yeah. So I've been in a lot of those meetings too. I mean, over the last 5 years, I've started to go to DC more and more often, like maybe once a quarter. And I think for the first three years or whatever, a lot of it was these kind of meetings where it was like, hi, good to meet you. Like, I'd love to educate you about crypto, and here's my one pager, and I'll run through some of the talking points. And they would politely listen, and it's great. And like people on the left would really resonate with it, usually from like a equality of opportunity point of view, and just providing financial services to people from all backgrounds. People on the right would kind of resonate with it from like a US national security, and how do you preserve dollar dominance and through stable coins. And then people would always have the same questions, about, well, what about money laundering and risks? And you'd talk about how, like less than half of 1% of all crypto transactions, according to third-party firms, are for illicit purposes. And the US dollar cash is like 3 or 4%. illicit activity. And so it's actually far safer. We work with law enforcement, et cetera, et cetera. And there'd be various, I'd say like 70, 80% of people I met in Congress were like very smart, curious, interested people, and just reasonable, I would say, about all these things, but they never really did anything about it. And then there was like 20 or 30% of people that were irrationally hostile to these ideas, and they basically either they thought the government should be running financial services and this was a threat to all of it, or they were just reading too much misinformation, which was sort of intentionally being put out by a small handful of people. And I had a few funny experiences too, where people, made vaguely threatening statements to me, like, once we're done with Facebook, we're going to come after you guys next, or something like that, so, you get some funny meetings too. But I think like what I realized over time was that these kind of educational meetings were a good first step, but they weren't actually going to get anybody to do anything in Congress. And we do have a very divided Congress. It doesn't really, someone gave me a great saying one time where they said Congress is really good at doing two things: nothing and overreacting. And so most of the time, nothing really gets done in our Congress at this point. There's a couple must-pass bills every year, and once in a while, like something will get tacked on to the end of that if the stars align. And so I think I realized over the last few years that the educational approach was not sufficient. And we actually needed to be, we were sort of basically at the little kids table in DC as an industry, crypto writ large, not just Coinbase. And so to actually be on everyone's radar and have political power in DC and actually matter, a couple things were required. One was that we needed to have money, and specifically the industry needed to be giving more to super PACs. If you looked at like big pharma, I think they might be on like a 400 million a year type range, and the big banks, oil and gas, are in the like maybe 100 million range, and crypto was like $1 million or something at that time, or literally like 1/100th of oil and gas or banking. And so one of the main things that people in Congress actually care about is just staying in Congress. Like, it's preserving their power. And so they don't really want to put their necks out for anything in particular unless it really helps them stay in power. And so having money, unfortunately, is a big part of the way the government works in the US, for better or worse. I actually think there's pros and cons to that. These industries are really just constituencies of voters, right? Like they're employees, shareholders, and customers who care about those things, which is just, it's kind of like, they're like unions or whatever in another format. So I'm actually not sure it's entirely bad. The second thing we needed to get was a big grassroots movement with a bunch of voters. And that's what ended up becoming standwithcrypto.org, which is another 501c4 that we donated to, along with, Fairshake was the super PAC we donated to, along with a bunch of others. Standwithcrypto.org is a C4 that we donated to. And that now has 1.3 million Americans who've raised their hand and said, hey, I really want to elect pro-crypto candidates and vote out anti-crypto candidates. And so it's now become quite risky, I would say even maybe political suicide, to be anti-crypto in DC. And so having like a real voting block that matters, having the super PACs, having like the Institute and different policy organizations that can write papers, which kind of feed into the supply chain of how DC thinks. These are all sort of legs of the stool that I think we as an industry have had to get better at. And the good news is that we're now, I think, on the cusp of actually getting some legislation passed in the United States. It's hard to say exactly when it'll happen, but there's a lot of really positive developments on that front.
Cool, great. Yeah, I mean, I think it's so weird. One of the things I learned in DC is that tech is historically kind of not great at advocacy in its own interests, and industries like you mentioned, oil, healthcare, et cetera, some of the traditional industries are actually much better at making their interests known in DC, which is sad in a way. So I'm glad I was just checking out the Stand with Crypto site. It claims over $170 million raised, which is really quite something. Is that donated by crypto advocates to the super PAC, which is really amazing.
Hey, we'll continue our interview in a moment after a word from our sponsors. Fast forward to the end of 2024. Think about your goals. What can you do right now to give yourself the best chance of succeeding? If learning a new language is on your list, you absolutely need to check out Babbel. Babbel offers a range of learning tools, self-study app lessons, live classes, and even podcasts, which have always been my favorite way to learn. Studies from Yale, Michigan State University, and others continue to prove Babbel is better. One study found that using Babbel for 15 hours is equivalent to a full semester at college. Babbel isn't just a game to kill time and make you feel like you're learning a language. It's not overly academic or rigid either. It's all about learning language for the real world. Babbel stands out because it's designed by real people using a modern conversational teaching approach. It's not always easy, nothing worth doing ever is, but it's straightforward and designed to help you start speaking in just 3 weeks. With Babbel, I was able to brush up on my intermediate Spanish to ramp up for travel to Argentina last year, and was able to set clear goals based on how much time each week I wanted to practice. Join millions of Babbel language learners across all age groups. Here's a special limited time offer for our listeners. Right now, get up to 60% off your Babbel subscription, but only for our listeners, at babbel.com/zen. Get up to 60% off at babbel.com/zen, spelled BABBEL.com/zen. Rules and restrictions may apply. Hey all, Erik Torenberg here. I'm hearing more and more that founders want to get profitable and do more with less, especially with engineering. Listen, I love your 30-year-old ex-FANG senior software engineer as much as the next guy, but honestly, I can't afford them anymore. Founders everywhere are trying to turn to global talent, but boy, is it a hassle to do at scale, from sourcing to interviewing to on-the-ground operations and management. That's why I teamed up with Sean Lanahan, who's been building engineering teams in Vietnam at a very high level for over 5 years to help you access global engineering without the headache. Squad, Sean's new company, takes care of sourcing, legal compliance, and local HR for global talent so you don't have to. With teams across Asia and South America, we can cover you no matter which time zone you operate in. Their engineers follow your process and use your tools. They work with React, Next.js, or your favorite front-end frameworks. And on the back end, they're experts at Node, Python, Java, and anything under the sun. Full disclosure, it's going to cost more than the random person you found on Upwork that's doing 2 hours of work per week but billing you for 40. But you'll get premium quality at a fraction of the typical cost. Our engineers are vetted top 1% talent and actually working hard for you every day. Increase your velocity without amping up burn. Head to choosesquad.com and mention Turpentine to skip the waitlist.
Brian, I want to shift slightly to something that, again, going back to my time at Coinbase didn't really have a muscle for, and I've seen it develop quite a bit over the last few years, is marketing. I think you guys have been investing a lot in marketing, and I think generally pretty well received. Obviously, the Super Bowl ad got a lot of play, but I've seen a bunch of these commercials that you guys have been putting out, and they seem really high production value. There's like a narrative, emotional component to it. I'd be curious what you've learned about marketing and kind of how you think it fits into the kind of overall puzzle of product and then some of this policy stuff.
Yeah, well, I'd say starting Coinbase, I really didn't know anything about marketing. You know, I was an engineer, kind of a product-oriented engineer. And I think in the early stages of companies, actually, you probably shouldn't hire a marketing team that does brand marketing. I think that only kind of makes sense at a certain scale. And early on, what we did at Coinbase was more like growth marketing. So we'd have, you could refer your friends and get $10 of crypto. That worked well in the product. We started to play with performance marketing at some point, and you have to be rigorous about how you measure that, but that can be positive and has more direct measurable ROI. Now, if you get to a certain size where we felt we actually needed to expand the audience that was interested in crypto, because we had a lot of early customers in the US and other countries, but we wanted to say, okay, how do we get the next adjacent concentric circle and expand out? And so we did a search for a while to find the right head of marketing. Kate Rao came in from Meta, and she's done an incredible job, built a really incredible team. And the thing I've learned the most about it is that she does a great job of, it's pretty data driven. Like, she'll actually go test a bunch of messages, ideas with consumers and try to hone in on what is the key thing that really they care about. And then crafting that into a compelling story is its own whole skill set, which she's built a great team for. So an example is we had a whole campaign around update the system, right? And what that came from, it initially started with research that she did with the average person. And they weren't necessarily people that were like crypto zealots or anything like that. They were people who said, I'm frustrated with the current financial system. Like, the fees are too high, there's delays, there's unequal access. And there's all these things that just don't really make sense, right? Like, you go in there you have to like write a paper check and, put it in the mail and it bounces. And like, it's just, why am I having to pay money to access my own money? And like the overdraft fees and these kind of things, right? So she realized through survey data that like 87% of Americans feel the current financial system is broken and doesn't really work for them. Now, they weren't necessarily thinking about crypto. And so then it was a matter of, with some folks on her team, to craft this really compelling narrative of how do you make this clear to people, right? And they came up with all these great videos about like, what if you ordered a pizza and like a slice was just like missing when it arrived, right, from the delivery guy or whatever? Like that would be kind of weird, right? And so they came up with all these creative ways to run that message, and it was a very successful campaign. Like people were just like, yeah, let's update the system. Like obviously, there's this whole younger generation of people that feel disenfranchised by it, and so that's done a great job of kind of getting another layer of people interested in crypto that I give them just tons of credit for.
Wanted to ask a question on increasing economic freedom in the world, which is, kind of Coinbase's overall mission, right? And I'm curious, are you guys tracking that with any type of like North Star metric, or is it a little bit more aspirational and you guys are focused on the kind of core parts of the business, knowing that if you do those kind of like core North Star metrics, it feeds into increasing economic freedom?
Yeah, so we just started putting this together from like a global macro point of view. So we actually want to start tracking what % of global GDP is running on crypto rails, because I think that'll be an interesting one to see over time. Like the internet, when it first, like probably back in 1999, 2000, 2001, maybe like less than 1% of the global GDP was running over e-commerce or the internet. And I believe now, especially with after COVID and everything, it maybe hit like 20% or 22%. So it's kind of funny because from my point of view, I'm like, for me, it's like probably close to 100%, right? If you buy a lot of stuff on Amazon and maybe pay your rent or something like electronically, but believe it or not, like still like 80% of global GDP is not even running on kind of through e-commerce or anything like that. And I think crypto will follow a similar trajectory, but it's only going to happen with a bunch of hard work. So I'm hoping we're sitting here in 10 years or something, and like maybe 25% of global GDP is running on crypto rails, and everything would be, I mean, it should just arrive instantly anywhere in the world for less than 1 cent. That's kind of now possible with Base and Layer 2, USD coin, stuff like that. I'm hoping that checking out online is just way simpler, right? Like it should be very similar to just a passkey or something like that, where you shouldn't have to like register for every website and give them all of this private information and your credit card. And it's like, ideally, we're actually trying to do this with Coinbase Commerce, where checking out with crypto is just the simplest way to pay, where either you scan a QR and there's one tap and it shares the money, the shipping address, whatever, or if you're not doing it from mobile, there could be a one tap experience on web as well. So that's going to take a lot of work, though. We've got a lot of the Lego pieces, but still there's complicated things. Like, for instance, there's a lot of layer 2 fragmentation right now, where it's like, oh, I have USDC on Arbitrum or Polygon or Base, or and all that stuff just has to kind of work. It has to quote unquote just work. So I think it's going to require some innovative payment protocols to get developed that just do the swapping and bridging kind of transparently in the background for the user. I'm curious, Dan, is there a kind of a global metric that you have in mind that that would be like, if we saw that starting to move? Because there are organizations that measure the economic freedom of the different countries around the world, like the Heritage Foundation and Fraser Institute, I think. And so you can watch those scores move over time. It only gets measured about once a year, so it's not a very real-time metric, and we would have to sort of estimate what % is attributable to crypto. Global GDP, we might be able to measure more often than that, but yeah, I'm trying to. Also, one other measure of this that I look at is how many people in the world are just using crypto, right, every day. And so I think there's maybe about 400 million people who've used crypto globally, not every day, but like just in general. And so we're at about 5% of the world. I think, in my mind, if we get to 1 or 2 billion people using crypto every day, that would be a signal to me that, let's just call it 1 billion as the next milestone. I think, like, as a daily use case, 1 billion people, we'd be able to measure that on chain. And that would tell me that we're making a pretty significant dent in the global economic freedom if that many people are actually using it. And I think the internet has only gotten to like 50 or 60% of global penetration even today. So that would take some time, but that would be a big one I would look for.
Yeah, I'm very bullish on stablecoins, in the sense that I think that, like, everyday use case, you don't have to worry about volatility, like, because of layer 2s, like fast, cheap, instant. I think the challenge is, traditionally, if you just kind of like start from like a Bitcoin centric or even ETH centric version of the world, is like expecting just the average person globally to own a highly volatile asset when they're probably not far from subsistence is probably not reasonable. Whereas in a world with stablecoins, it's actually very practical. And if it's USD coin, you're actually not susceptible to the local inflation, right? Like, yes, there's some inflation happening in the US, but it's probably better than most places. And so I think just stablecoins generally, and then even, Tether, which has existed forever and kind of always in this weird limbo state, like you see countries like Turkey where people are actually using it. And so I think just as a category, stablecoins feel like the most exciting thing happening in crypto from an actual practical use case. And I think it's very easy to dismiss in the US because we have a pretty advanced payment system in the scheme of things. And so the average consumer with their, cashback credit card might not care. But globally, I actually think it is pretty impactful. And then just all the little paper cuts, as you kind of pointed out in the marketing, talking about that, I think basically getting to a world where actual money is programmable, not, using layers on top of traditional fintech stuff. I think just the ability to just actually say, take the USDC and address A and move it to address B and have that be instant. I think that's pretty great. And I think that you can actually just measure that. And I think you start to layer in kind of proof of humanity effectively, whether that's something like WorldCoin or the stuff that you guys are doing with Coinbase, given that you have 100+ million customers with KYC and you're doing an attestation on chain. I'm optimistic that 5 years from now, you can actually, the crypto economic data will actually be, albeit probably smaller, far more reliable and transparent than if you just think of the economic statistics we get in the US, right? It's okay, how did you actually get to this? And it's they call and survey people. And it's shouldn't we be using actual data at scale with credit card spend or whatever? But I think in a world where that stuff is on chain, the metrics will just be open. It'll be a Dune dashboard.
Yeah.
Matt?
No, I think Truflation is pretty cool, actually, if you've seen that. And it's an on-chain way to try to measure actual inflation. And it kind of ingests pricing data on the internet from millions of data points a day or probably more. I don't know if this is true. Somebody told me that the way that the US government actually measures inflation, it's literally a couple hundred people with iPads that walk around to stores and gas stations and stuff like that. And it's pretty manual. So it's kind of shocking that there's not a more a broader view of what it actually is. And so I'm excited about these things like Truflation to try to measure actual inflation on chain.
Having a Dune dashboard for the American economy would be amazing.
But also create accountability, right? You can't explain away things. You can't revise that. It's they're live all the time, right?
Yeah, it is. I mean, a lot of governments Argentina and all these, you never can trust the actual numbers coming out, right? And so you'd hope that the US would be immune from that. But you start to see these inflation reports come out that they exclude certain categories and this and that. And you start to wonder, again, it comes back to this source of truth question that we all are trying to struggle with at this time.
Random question, Brian. One of the going jokes at MOZ is that I'm the pro-Euro person, although recently with EU commissioner chiming in on a bunch of internet stuff, I'm a little bit less pro-European than I used to be. But one random question, and I think we've raised this in the show before, why did it take so long to get a Euro stablecoin? I think Circle recently, I don't even know how to pronounce it, EURC, I guess, EURC, an actual Euro pegged stable. I'm curious if you have any thoughts why that only came to market kind of recently, and why basically every stablecoin has been a USD related sort of stablecoin.
Mm-hmm. Well, I mean, I think everyone just starts with the most important thing, and there was a lot of work to do to get the USD stablecoins really solid, right? Getting strong bank partners when Operation Choke Point 2.0 was happening was a big issue. I mean, frankly, in the kind of this current administration, I guess you'd say, or last under Biden with Elizabeth Warren and Gary Gensler, I mean, we really had an administration that was trying to kill the whole industry. So that was major headwinds, right? Which required everyone's focus and attention. Now, Europe is, I think they were receptive to these ideas and they weren't that opposed to it, but it was always a second priority. So I don't know the exact details. I think Circle did really good work there, though, just getting that off the ground. And it's another important one. They may add one or two more in the future, but it's not the highest part. I think if you get the top 3 or 4 fiats, you got most of it.
Brian, I would want to shift over a little bit to New Limit if you're willing to talk about that. I'm curious, just for the listeners, what progress have you made? Obviously there's a pretty big announcement, a year and a half ago in terms of funding this new thing, and kind of maybe what drew you to it to begin with, and then kind of what are you guys building and the progress you've made?
Yeah, well, I guess just zooming out for a sec. I mean, one of the things I get really excited about is just technological, scientific progress. I think it's the underpinning of all human civilizational progress, etc. And I want to see a world where, basically techno-optimist, like, accelerationist outcome here, where things get improved faster and faster. So I always just think about what are the barriers to that. Anyway, we're living in this golden age of software innovation, and some fortunes are being made. It's already really hard to build a startup in software, but it's easier than doing a hard tech company, I think, right? And so I almost feel like people who have had some success in the software world have an obligation to kind of go help hard tech companies come to fruition. Elon's been a great example of this, I think, with PayPal early on, and then he went for some of these hard tech companies that were incredibly ambitious. And I think if there's a lesson from Elon, it's that you should try more ambitious startups. OpenAI is a good example of that. There's others too. So long story short is, Coinbase took 10 years to go from kind of this prototype on my laptop to becoming a public company in 2021. When the company went public, you're able to get a little bit of liquidity as a founder, and especially if you do a direct listing, which is its own topic. And so I started to think about, okay, what do I want to do with some capital here to try to accelerate civilizational progress, right? And I started, if you write down kind of what are the big technology trends in the world, I think crypto and economic freedom is obviously a very big one, which we're helping move the needle on. And then there's a handful of others, right? It's like, fusion energy, along with nuclear, maybe there's brain-machine interfaces, there's AI, there's space. So there's a handful of these like really important tech trends that are, you could see coming to fruition in the next 10, 20 years. And one of them was around longevity. And so I think there's good companies already being built in the fusion space, the space, AI, brain machine interfaces, et cetera. And I felt like, I don't have too much to add there. There's already really smart and brilliant teams working on that. I was interested in longevity in biotech because I had a sense that with the advent of like CRISPR and some new tools like CAR T cells and these things coming online, like bio was going to start to become a little bit more like engineering instead of some big scientific black box. Cost of single cell sequencing was also coming down, by orders. It was sort of like following a Moore's law. And so I didn't really know anything about the field, but one technique I'd recommend to people is like, if you're interested in some area, but you're not really sure what to do, which was kind of where I was, just start to host dinners with smart people. It sounds like a simple technique, but I actually think it works pretty well, because if you just kind of reach out to your network and like, who are the smartest biotech CEOs or scientists in my case, and I was just like, hey, just come to this dinner and just ask everyone to go around the room and give like a 3-minute update on what's the most exciting thing you're seeing on the horizon in your field that you think is being underinvested in, or whatever you're just most excited about. And, most of the stuff people will say isn't going to resonate, but you'll start to hear occasionally an interesting idea and you want to double click on it. Maybe if you host more of these dinners, like, invite back the people who lean in and say the most interesting stuff, and like replace the ones that don't, and you'll eventually like triangulate something. So in this case, I invited Blake Byers, who was a friend of mine. He was a biotech VC, had started a biotech company. He invited a bunch of people. Anyway, long story short, we started to hear about this idea of epigenetic reprogramming come up a few times. And it was one of these things I started to learn more about, and I kind of went farther down the rabbit hole. And it's an exciting idea because epigenetic reprogramming basically talks about how you can restore, reprogram your cells to a different state, right? It could be a different cell type, but it could also be a different cell age, and restore function that the cell used to have when it was younger. And there'd been some early promising work in this area, including going back to like the Yamanaka factors, which won the Nobel Prize, I think from 2006 or 7. But a lot of people had done derivative research of that so far, which showed that some interesting results that, our cells are actually more plastic than we think. Like you can turn a skin cell into a neuron, and turn a neuron into a muscle cell. And you can do it by just, because our cells all have the same DNA. They're just expressing different genes depending on what kind of cell they need to be in your body. And so, and the Yamanaka factors had shown you could actually change cell age and cell type. And so in some ways we were like, oh, maybe what if would it be possible just to change the cell age without changing the cell type, and sort of do half of that? And so, yeah, I mean, basically Blake and I started through these dinners and other tactics, like trying to find the right founding team for this. And we were able to put in some of our own money, and eventually company raised a Series A as well from Founders Fund, Kleiner Perkins, et cetera. By the way, I had a lot of, at this time, whenever you're looking at a new field, you're always thinking like, am I crazy? This sounds like, it sounded really, I started to get really interested in it and excited about it, but I was like, you're in a new field, maybe maybe I have no idea what I'm doing. But right around that time, like Altos got announced with like $3 billion in funding from Bezos and Yuri, million people. And then like Sam Altman funded Retro with like 150 million. I was like, okay, I'm not crazy. There's something exciting happening here. And those are both great companies, and I think they're on a good path. But we're doing something a little different at New Limit, which is we're actually searching for novel sets of transcription factors that might reprogram cells to restore function to when they're younger. And so anyway, just you asked for a quick progress update. There's some good progress update videos online if you search New Limit progress update on YouTube. But long story short, we're building this discovery engine, scaling it up. We've tested about 4,000 different sets of transcription factors. About 0.5% of those, or 20 of them, have demonstrated some phenotypic rejuvenation. We're now running those through functional assays. So it's a discovery pipeline. You start with like machine learning, simulating a bunch of things in silico. You take the most promising of those, you run them in giant pooled screens. You're trying to turn the crank on how much we can dial that up. You basically take the best of those and run them through functional screens. You take the best of those, run them through human trials or in animal models. And all that data, by the way, gets put back into your machine learning model at the top. So it's this kind of virtuous flywheel. And so anyway, we've assembled a really amazing team of folks, and that's been a fun project to kick off and try to figure out longevity and aging for humans. That'll be a big one if we're able to figure that out for humanity.
And my follow-up here would be, I imagine you obviously have your toolkit of having grown Coinbase from the prototype on your laptop to a big public company. You have how to hire people, how to, all the kind of general startup stuff. I'd be curious, what has been the most surprising thing about shifting from purely digital crypto to, biotech? And like, what is something that over the last year you've learned, or you feel like you're kind of a new skill set?
Yeah. Well, you're right. So a lot of the company building skills, I think, are actually translatable, and there's fair degree of overlap. So, one thing, of course, is I just didn't know, I wasn't very fluent in biology, right? And so, I started off by actually trying to just read through some textbooks. And I don't know, some people might be smarter than me and they can do that, like just breeze through like a college or graduate level textbook on some of these things, functional genomics or whatever. I found it to be a very frustrating experience because, you'd like read a sentence and like 4 of the words in that sentence I would have to go look up. So it's like super slow and laborious. If it's like you have to look up a word every couple paragraphs or something, maybe that's fine. But like 4 per sentence is you're kind of screwed. So what I did was I actually hired a biology tutor, which I'd recommend. If you just want to get up to speed on any topic, you can just hire a tutor. One of our SAB members, scientific advisory board members, kind of referred me to one of his former grad students. So I had for like 2 years on Sunday afternoon, I would like do a little biology tutoring with these kind of former grad student who now like scientists at Stanford. I had some like incredible tutors actually that were like, one of them was the CTO of this company that had been worth like, it got sold for billions of dollars and stuff. Like, it's amazing the tutors you can get if you want to put a little bit of money toward it. But yeah, so I got up to speed on that. The other thing that I think is a little different in biotech is that as opposed to software companies, there's kind of this, it's relatively easy to raise like a Series A. And then there's kind of this valley of death in like the Series B, Series C landscape where a lot of biotech companies get forced to kind of go public sooner than they would ordinarily want to. And then because they have unpredictable or no revenue, they get hammered in the public markets. It's actually, I think, a really bad thing. And a lot of them end up doing partnerships with big pharma to try to get their first dollars of revenue in, and kind of, so it's sort of like big pharma is kind of like an alternative to raising venture capital in the Series C, B stage. Anyway, these are things which are learnable. I don't think they're that different. I think that more people who've been successful in tech should go into hard tech companies and try to bring some of those skill sets, because I actually think a lot of the biotech stuff could use more tech influence. That's a longer conversation, but there's sort of a risk aversion, a little too much of an academic mindset, I think sometimes, that is not conducive to good company building.
Two of the stars of the show, Dan Romero and frequent guest Balaji, are, of course, spent a lot of time with you and at Coinbase. Can you talk about their main contributions to your thought and to the company's development, their legacy and contributions?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so I think Dan, first of all, was like, you got to give him credit for just being willing to join some ragtag crew of misfits early on. He spotted something which 99.9% of people missed, which was that this was going to be a big deal, a big trend. And as a non-engineer, you kind of have to like earn your chops inside these companies. And I'd say he did that instantly. And he did it by just kind of being willing to do anything and outwork anyone. He basically was like, I need to come in and add value any way I can. So he's like, oh, Silicon Valley Bank is going to close our bank account. Like, no problem. I'm going to get on a plane and fly to Europe, and I'm not coming back until we have another bank. And in that case, it was in Europe, but he got as many banks, U.S., Europe, all over the world. I also just think Dan this kind of comes from a little bit of that consulting background too, but he just is able to be an incredibly clear communicator and leader. And sometimes people, and you can just throw him into kind of any complex, messy, hairy problem, and he'll find a way to boil it down to simplicity, get everyone aligned, and have clear next steps and move forward. And it was just like that's just a breath of fresh air. It's hard to find people like that. I think Keith Rabois calls them like barrels or ammunition or something. He has some kind of metaphor like that. But if you can find people you can throw into the gnarliest, nastiest problem in the company that nobody really wants to deal with because it's a complete shit show, which those come up every week or so, and do it with enthusiasm, because he's deriving his source of motivation from like, does this help the company and the mission and advance? Does it create value in the company? It doesn't matter if it's the shittiest job in the world. It's like, oh, I gotta go have 14 meetings with people and deliver bad news. It's like, great, let me go do it. Most employees, they just want to work on the thing that they're like really good at. They're like, I don't know, I'm a front-end engineer that only does like React Native or whatever, and like they only want to do that one thing. And Dan was just like, give me the shittiest job, as long as it creates value in the company, I'll be motivated. So that was incredible. Balaji, I don't know, where do we start? He's truly a genius. He's probably top 3 smartest people I've ever met in the whole world. IQ wise, I think he's just off the charts, and he's spotting trends in the world. Now, at those levels of IQ, things get quirky, right? So you gotta take the good with the bad, and like occasionally he'll call me and tell me something, and I'm like, dude, you're completely nuts. Like, what the hell are you talking about, right? I mean, actually, a lot of the time that happens, and then I'd say a good percent of the time, he turns out to be right. Like whether it's a year or 5 years later. So I don't know. My one liner on Balaji is, I think he's a genius. I think he's usually early but right, and I'm so glad that we have him on Team Human, and yeah, I love him to death. So let's keep listening to his ideas, because I think that it's a good glimpse into the future.
Are you in a secure location, Brian? Do you get those calls as well occasionally?
Those are the best phone calls to get from Balaji. Usually at 1 a.m. or something like that. Are you in a secure location? I've never met anybody who starts phone calls like that, but it's epic. I gotta love that. I think everybody's had that experience too, where you get a call from Balaji and you're like, oh, do I have anything to do for the next 2 hours? Because this could be a long call.
I think the way I describe Balaji is that his vector is always pointed in the right direction. The magnitude of the vector might be off, maybe a little bit too big, or it's rarely too small, but the vector is always pointed in the right direction, almost always.
Yeah. My favorite part of a Balaji call is it abruptly ends with, good talk, hang up. And then you didn't even get to say anything. You just do it.
Exactly. He just wanted to install something in your brain, and then you're like, okay, but he's like, okay, good talk, bye. Yeah. I will say Balaji was very right on a lot of the media landscape. I mean, he was one of the first people who started being in my ear about that. Like, the media is fake. No one's going to trust it. It's in decline. And at the time I was like, yeah, but it's like, we still got to interact with them because it's still important. And he was totally right on the curve. The curves are pretty much crossed on that. If you look at like the level of trust in media is just traditional media, I should say. I think almost like the only time traditional media matters now is like people over 60 on the East Coast. It's like it's becoming increasingly irrelevant. Still matters for DC because the average age in Congress is super high, and so they read traditional media, but they're kind of living in their own echo chamber on that. Frankly, a lot of the DEI stuff, like he was early on that too, and we had our own issues with that, which led us to the Mission First blog post, and so he was early, kind of warning me about this is worse than you think it is, and I was like, really? I don't think it's that big of a deal. So he's been right on some stuff.
I think the great Balaji phrase there is go direct, which I think everybody in Silicon Valley has actually adopted as their new PR strategy. Like I'm old enough to remember back in the day, you'd hire a PR firm and then try to get into TechCrunch and be this whole thing. And now you just like tweet a post, and that's it. That's the PR strategy. And it actually works much better because it feels very authentic coming from the actual founder.
Yeah, we've never, the 4 years of Farcaster, we've never gone to media. It just like we just tweet or cast, right? Like it just direct.
Yeah. We're in the same boat. I think for our average customer, traditional media doesn't really matter at this point. We would just do 100% new media, and that's why I spend time doing podcasts, things like this. We still are trying to do some policy work in DC that fits the definition of people over 60 on the East Coast. So, you could say some public market investors, but I'd say most of them actually do new media now too. So anyway, I do like an 80-20 strategy. I do 80% of my time on new media, 20% on traditional media, mostly for East Coast seniors.
Well, the reality with YouTube is, if someone searches your name, they can get actually like multiple videos, different perspectives, different topics, and actually is going to have a much fuller picture of you than like one article where they get to choose the quote that fits their narrative.
Yeah.
In closing, we also just want to say that the industry owes you a lot of gratitude for your, mission first company, blog post that you wrote a few years ago, which was very controversial at the time, but has since been adopted by many, incredible tech companies and is now kind of industry standard. So thank you for doing that. And thanks for joining us today on Moment of Zen.
Yeah. Thanks for having me.
Brian.
Thanks, Brian.
Hey everyone, Erik here. At Turpentine, we're building the first media outlet for tech people by tech people. We're the network behind the show you're listening to right now. We have a slate of hit shows across a range of topics and industries, from our AI and investing cluster of podcasts to shows that drive the conversation in tech with the most interesting thinkers, founders, investors, and influencers, like Econ 102 with Noah Smith. We're launching new shows every week, and we're looking for industry-leading sponsors. If you think that might be you and your company, email me at erikaturpentine.co. That's ERIK at turpentine.co, and let's partner together.